Picture this. It's 1980. Big hair, boom boxes, and the birth of hip-hop. The US is dealing with the crack epidemic, rising crime rates, and the so-called war on drugs. Over the next 2 decades, from the 80s to the early 2000s, cities like Baltimore, which coincidentally both Westmores grew up, are hit especially hard by poverty, racial inequality, and mass incarceration. Now, enter Westmore. But wait, which Westmore? That's the question at the heart of The Other Westmore. One West grows up to be a Rhodes Scholar, Army officer, and future politician, while the other ends up serving life in prison for armed robbery and murder. Same name, same city, but vastly different futures. So, what happened? That's what our Westmore, the author, sets out to explore. He was raised by a determined single mother and eventually found mentors who pushed him towards his success. The other Westmore struggled in an environment where drugs and crime seemed like the only way out. Through their parallel stories, the book, The Other Westmore, which was published in 2010, forces us to question how much of our fate is really in our own hands and how much is shaped by the world we're born into. The Other Westmore, the novel, makes one thing very, very clear. The difference between success and struggle isn't always as simple as personal choice.
For purposes of this video, we will be referring to the author as Moore and his counterpart as West.
Now, the author Westmore did not want to make The Other Westmore boring, and by doing so, he added some important author choices to kind of captivate the reader. But these author choices were foreshadowing, imagery, perspective shifts, syntax, free indirect discourse, and characterization. And these combined author choices create a very compelling and contrasting story between the two main characters, and it also adds depth to the story, allowing the readers to better understand both Moore's different divergent paths. And we're going to take a journey throughout the book to understand these different author choices. First, we have foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is usually used to kind of show the future of the story and kind of allow readers to see with little hints on how the story really will end. And author Westmore does this throughout the interviews. There's certain quotes that he pulls out of each interview to add to the prequel of the chapter. An example of foreshadowing is on chapter 2, page 28. Westmore writes, "Young boys are more likely to believe in themselves if they know that someone somewhere who shares that belief. There's someone somewhere that shares that belief." Kind of further showing that community is going to play a bigger role in their life. Another author choice is imagery. West uses imagery throughout the text as a device to describe turning points of the text. He used imagery in important parts, like when Moore moved to the Bronx, describing the Bronx as 7-story monoliths, walls and floors coated with filth, urines and stairways, kept in check by gunstrap kids and nightmare army of drug fiends. Just kind of giving extra detail of the points that are very important to him. For West, he chose the important parts that changed West's life. Like an example was when his mom, Mary, found the drugs in his room. Our next example is perspective shifts. This authorial choice shows the parallels between West and Moore's life, and you can kind of see how similar their familial structures were in their household, but how the values in their house changed, and how a main value was education, where with lack thereof or the emphasis of education. Another example is syntax. Throughout the nonfiction, Moore uses syntax to change the base of the text. He slows down for the important parts, or speeds up for the parts where it's fast-paced, like when he went to jail, or the robbery. It's just a fast-paced things that because it was happening fast, where he may not have as much information. Lastly, free indirect discourse. West uses this literary device to kind of allow the readers to embody the characters, especially the surrounding characters, to understand different perspectives.
Now, let's talk themes, and we can start with parenthood and familial relationships. The author Westmore had a very strong mother who prioritized education and discipline, even when sending him to military school when he started slipping. He also had a father, but his father died in his early childhood, so that also shaped a lot of the way he grew up. And the other Westmore, his father was also absent, and his mother, despite wanting better for him, struggled to steer him away from the streets. This difference in parental support played a major role in shaping their path. Another major theme is violence. In the novel, violence was more so kind of their way of life. Both Westmore saw death at a very young age, too. For the other West, fights, guns, crime, that became normal, and he even found his way in jail because of it. And the author Wes had also very close calls, but discipline and mentors helped steer him away from that path. Lastly, the last theme, and probably the biggest theme, or the one I think you should probably talk about if you're writing a paper too, is choices and second chances. In The Other Wes Moore, the author Wes Moore had made a lot of mistakes, which is a very human thing to do, but he always had people to pull him back onto the right path. But The Other Wes Moore, with him, it was sort of one bad decision led to another, and without a safety net or people to pull him back, those mistakes became very permanent. The Other Wes Moore highlights how a single opportunity, or even the lack of one, can change the entire course of one's life.
So now that we've had our stunning synopsis of The Other Wes Moore, let's answer 2 real paper 2 questions to understand how we could use The Other Wes Moore on a paper 2 to get a 7 on our IB exams. Let's head to the thought bubble. Hey guys, and welcome to the Crash Course Thought Bubble, where we'll be answering the question, how far and in what ways do characters in your chosen text challenge the social and cultural norms of their time? Now, the 2 important parts of this question is how far and in what ways. And remember, it's and, so you have to talk about both. The how far refers to what extent do the characters challenge the norms, and the in what ways is asking what do the characters actually do, and this also includes the authorial choices that the authors use. So I've chosen to compare The Other Wes Moore to Pride and Prejudice, hooray, smiley face, and there are some obvious differences, like time period, for example. The Other Wes Moore was written in 2010, and Pride and Prejudice in 1813. Location is also different. Pride and Prejudice was written in London, and The Other Wes Moore was written in Baltimore, Maryland. And the genre is also different. The Other Wes Moore is nonfiction, Pride and Prejudice is fiction. However, in both of these texts, what really helps to answer this question effectively is the contrast between the characters in each of the texts. So, in The Other Wes Moore, that is the contrast between Wes and Moore. And in Pride and Prejudice, it's the contrast between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy and Mrs. Bennet. So Moore challenges cultural norms by becoming everything society tells him he can't. So that includes becoming a Rhodes Scholar, joining the military, and getting his college education, all of which for a child of a single-parent household in Baltimore were super rare. Wes, on the other hand, answers this question because he does not challenge the social and cultural norms of the time. Instead, he sort of falls back into what society expects him to be. So he becomes incarcerated, and gets involved in the drug industry, which was common for children of single-parent households to do in Baltimore. In Pride and Prejudice, the cultural norms, it's instead marrying for status, and Elizabeth and Darcy challenged this by marrying for love instead. Their decision to marry for love and put aside any prejudices and pride, get it, that allowed them to challenge the norms. And Mrs. Bennet was the opposite, because all she wanted was money, and she wanted her daughters to marry to benefit the family's financial status and nobility, or like the noble status of the family. And so she is the character that does not challenge the social and cultural norms. And so now I'll talk about the authorial choices that each author uses. So in The Other Wes Moore, one of the really big ones is the perspective switches that Moore employs, like either talking through his own experiences and then putting those side by side with Wes to really show where their paths diverged. And free and direct discourse is also used a lot, as is imagery. But I would say the main one that really answers this question and is the most pinnacle in the book is perspective switching. And in Pride and Prejudice, there's also a lot of free and direct discourse, so there's a similarity. And Austen also employs satire, especially through the character of Mrs. Bennet, to convey the ridiculousness of marrying for status. And I'd probably do a block style for The Other Wes Moore and then Pride and Prejudice, but yeah. One IB question we will be exploring is discuss how 2 works you have studied present concepts of good and bad, not as absolute notions, but as a matter of individual perception. To answer this question, you'll have to choose which work you'll use alongside The Other Wes Moore, and for this example, we'll be using everyone's favorite text to analyze The Handmaid's Tale. First, we'll have to interpret the question. What does the question mean when it says not as absolute notions, but as a matter of individual perception? I interpret it as absolute notions being something that everyone can agree on, while individual perception, there's some debate to be had. So I will be arguing it as such, and I will explain how I will argue it.
Moore explores the concept of good and bad through the theme of choices, and he leaves it as a matter of individual perception, as there is no real answer as to whether a choice a character makes is good or bad. A specific scene to look at would be when Wes goes back to selling drugs. Some might say that his heart was in the right place, he was doing what was best for his family, whereas others might say that this is unacceptable in society and it was a bad choice. There is no right answer, and therefore it is a matter of individual perception. This can be seen in other places of the book, like Wes's and Moore's mothers, and the decisions they make for their sons. To summarize our answer to this question, our argument may be that Moore supports the idea of good versus bad only being able to be evaluated by the individual through the theme of choices. In The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, the concept of good and bad being a matter of individual perception is also explored through choices and decisions. Some examples of decisions that characters make is when the commander chooses to bring Offred to one of the sex clubs that reside in Gilead, or when the doctor chooses to help offer to impregnate Offred in light of the commander's infertility. The morality of these decisions can be called into question, and thus relate back to the concept of good versus bad through the theme of choices. Using this text, we can answer the question by saying that Atwood indeed shows the concept of good versus bad through the decisions of the individual characters, and leaves it as a matter of individual perception, as the use of first person forces the reader to form their own opinions about the morality of the choices each character makes. Both texts explore the concept of good versus bad as a matter of individual perception through the theme of choices, but how would we compare and contrast how the two different authors do this? Areas to consider for comparison may be the use of individual characters as mediums for the authors to convey the concept, or oppression which is seen in both books and how that affects whether or not a choice is perceived as good or bad by the reader. Areas to consider for contrast would be third versus first person in the context of the question, or how the different settings affect how the authors must explore the concept.
If you want to understand how these two people with the same name in the same area with the same familiar structure end up with such different lives, read The Other Wes Moore. Or just watch this video again to understand. The Other Wes Moore does a brilliant job of showing the dichotomous paths of these two Wes Moores. Nitpicking the basis of this compelling text will also allow readers like you to understand the fundamentals of a good text, or a chance to learn that second chances in life are pretty fleeting. So, carpe diem.